The bell above the cafe door jingled, the soft chime that usually meant nothing, but not today. The place was small, just a local corner shop in Chicago's South Side. Brick walls, low jazz playing, the scent of cinnamon rolls and burnt espresso lingering in the air. On most mornings it was a quiet haven between chaos, a buffer zone between the street and the world. Zaria Bell sat alone by the window, a half-empty cup of chai beside her, fingers tapping lightly on a silver laptop. She wore a plain black blazer over a ribbed turtleneck, jeans, and clean sneakers. Her natural curls were tied back in a puff, her makeup minimal. If you didn't know her, you'd pass her by without a second glance. And that's exactly what she wanted. At 27, Zaria had long ago learned the power of invisibility, how to move through rooms without drawing attention, how to watch, how to wait. She glanced at her watch again. 10:58 a.m. Her father would be out of the budget meeting in 15 minutes. She sipped her chai, eyes drifting back to the screen. That's when he walked in. Officer Brad Connolly. Late 30s, wide frame, crooked nose, a badge too polished for the man wearing it. He strolled in with the kind of swagger reserved for men who thought every room belonged to them. Two other uniformed cops followed behind, both younger, quieter. You could tell they were just shadows. The moment Brad saw Zaria, he locked in like a heat-seeking missile. He didn't recognize her. Not really. To him, she was just another black woman sitting alone, typing too fast, looking too confident. And that was enough. He made his way to the counter, ordered a black coffee, and didn't wait for it. Walked straight over to Zaria's table like he had business to conduct. Zaria looked up, calm. "Yes," she said. Brad tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You waiting on someone?" "Yes," she replied evenly. He smirked. "Boyfriend, lawyer, social worker?" She said nothing, just sipped her drink again. Brad leaned a little closer, resting one hand on her table like he was staking a claim. "You know, sitting here all secretive like that makes people nervous," he said too loudly. Zaria didn't blink. "People, or just you?" The smirk faded. He looked around. A few patrons were watching now. A barista paused mid-wipe on a mug, and then, like he'd done it 100 times before, Brad lifted his coffee. What happened next was fast and coldly intentional. He tilted the cup. Hot black coffee spilled out in an arc across the table, splashing Zaria's chest, her hands, and her laptop. A few droplets hit her cheek. The room gasped. Someone let out a sharp, "Hey!" But no one moved. Brad didn't even pretend it was an accident. "Oops," he said flatly. "Guess you'll learn not to give me attitude next time." Zaria sat still. The heat of the coffee seared through her shirt, but her hands didn't tremble. Her breath didn't hitch. Her jaw didn't clench. She slowly closed her laptop, wiped her fingers. Then, with agonizing calm, she reached into her bag and pulled out a phone. Brad laughed. "Gonna film me? Call the ACLU? Be my guest." Zaria didn't record. She just made a single call. It rang twice. Then a voice on the other end. "Zaria, you okay?" Her reply was measured, but loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Yeah, Dad. I'm fine, but you might want to come around the corner." Brad's grin faltered. Zaria stood up. Her shirt was stained. Her laptop is dripping, but her spine straight as a sword. "I'll be outside," she said, and walked out of the cafe like a queen leaving court. 10 minutes later, 4 black SUVs with city seals pulled up in front of the shop. Doors opened. Mayor Charles Bell stepped out. Gray suit, navy tie, face carved from stone. He didn't shout, didn't gesture. He simply entered the cafe, walked up to Brad, and said one sentence. "You just assaulted the mayor's daughter." The room froze. Brad's badge might have protected him before, but not today. Zaria was used to being underestimated. It had followed her like a second skin since childhood, not just for being black, not just for being a woman, but for being his daughter. Charles Bell wasn't always a mayor. Once he was just a factory worker who marched in protests, carried megaphones, and raised his only child in a 2-bedroom apartment with more books than furniture. He was stern, sharp-tongued, and principled to a fault. And Zaria? She was a firecracker, all questions and no fear. A girl who read Baldwin at 12 and challenged her civics teacher by 13. "Know the game before they even know you're playing it," her father used to say. But never forget, the board is rigged. For most of her life, Zaria believed him. Until she didn't. The split came slowly. She was 17 when Charles first ran for city council. What started as activism became strategy. What once was a street protest turned into a televised debate. He traded marches for policies, bullhorns for microphones, and Zaria hated it. "He's becoming one of them," she told her best friend during a sleepover, eyes burning. "Telling people to trust a system we know is broken." She didn't speak to him for 2 weeks after his first campaign speech, where he told a crowd, "Change doesn't happen in chaos, it happens in chambers." But deep down she knew it wasn't that simple. Her anger wasn't just political. It was personal. Because no matter how powerful her father became, she was still treated like she didn't belong. In stores, in elevators, in classrooms filled with kids whose parents whispered behind her back. She remembered a high school counselor suggesting she aim lower on college applications, even though she had a 4.2 GPA and captained the debate team. She remembered the time a security guard followed her through a bookstore, only to call her combative when she asked why. She remembered how her father would always say, "Keep your head down, make it undeniable, outwork them until they have no excuses." But Zaria didn't want to work around the system. She wanted to confront it. College gave her the space to breathe. She went to NYU, double-majored in public policy and psychology, and finally found professors who didn't call her aggressive for asking hard questions. But the weight never left. One rainy night in Brooklyn, she was walking home from a volunteer shift at a shelter when a squad car pulled over. 2 officers stepped out. One asked for ID. She was holding leftover sandwiches. He accused her of stealing from a deli. She smiled politely, gave them her student ID. They weren't satisfied. They cuffed her anyway. She spent 4 hours in a holding cell with her backpack zip-tied shut and her dignity dented. They never filed charges, never apologized. Her father flew in that night, walked into the precinct like a loaded gun in a tailored suit, had the mayor of New York on the line before the lieutenant could finish asking, "What seems to be the issue?" They released her immediately. But something inside Zaria cracked. It wasn't just about racism. It wasn't just about trauma. It was about power. Who had it, who abused it, and who was allowed to decide how much her life mattered. She came home to Chicago 6 months later, quietly. No press, no social media post. Just a job offer from a grassroots policy firm and an apartment on the West Side. Her father by then had become the city's mayor. Their first dinner was tense. "You left Harvard Law on a full ride," he reminded her. "For what? Writing reports for people who can't even get a meeting with my office?" Zaria didn't raise her voice. She rarely did anymore. "I'm not interested in saving the system from the top," she said. "I want to build something new from the ground." That night, her father didn't argue. He just nodded. "You're your mother's child," he whispered, and she smiled, because it was the first time he'd said it in years. But love didn't erase friction. They still butted heads. Still lived in different universes, one built from ballots and briefings, the other from broken sidewalks and stolen futures. And yet, every Sunday they had breakfast. Every other Thursday she helped him prep for council sessions. She called him Mr. Mayor when she wanted to tease. He called her Z when he wanted to say sorry. There was respect, a cautious, hard-earned kind. But neither expected the next battle to come not in chambers or policy memos, but in a coffee shop. And now, just 24 hours after that burn still cooling on her collarbone, Zaria sat in the back seat of a black SUV, her laptop wiped, her blouse still faintly stained. She was quiet, but her mind was loud. Because this wasn't just about some arrogant cop with a superiority complex. It was about what happens when the powerful mistake someone for powerless, and what happens when they realize they were wrong. Brad Connolly had never felt fear in that coffee shop before. He'd strutted into that place for years, barked orders, cut in line, flirted inappropriately with the college baristas, and watched people move out of his way like he owned the floor tiles. But this time, he didn't own the air anymore. Because now, Charles Bell was standing in it. The mayor's presence hit like a thunderclap. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. He simply walked into the cafe with 4 staffers behind him and a silence that pulled every eye toward the door. Brad's first instinct was denial. He straightened his spine, adjusted his belt, and puffed his chest like it might cover the mistake already leaking through every corner of the room. "Mr. Mayor," he said, forcing a smile. "Didn't expect." But Charles didn't stop walking. He crossed the floor with measured calm until he was standing inches from Brad. "You just assaulted my daughter," he said, voice low, controlled, like a dam holding back a flood. What?" Brad laughed, glancing around. "Wait, her? She didn't even say who she was. How was I supposed to know?" Zarya stood quietly near the wall, arms crossed, eyes locked on him like lasers. "That's the thing," she said coolly. "You didn't care." Brad's jaw worked in slow confusion. "You set me up." "No," Zarya said, stepping forward. "You set yourself up. I just happened to be in the room when you proved exactly who you are." The barista behind the counter pulled out her phone and began recording. And just like that, the spell was broken. Other patrons who'd stayed frozen now lifted phones, pressed record, and started whispering. One of Brad's fellow officers took a half step back, suddenly realizing he was standing next to a grenade with no pin. "You poured hot coffee on her?" Charles asked, finally turning to the room. No one spoke. The barista whispered, "He did." "On my daughter," he repeated, in front of a dozen witnesses, in uniform. Brad's smugness was unraveling now, dripping off him like sweat. "Sir, this is being taken out of context. I thought she was a threat." Zarya cut in. "What threat was I, Officer Connolly? My laptop? My tea? Or was it just that I didn't flinch when you tried to intimidate me?" The mayor's eyes narrowed. "You're done." Brad's voice rose a notch, defensive. "Wait, this isn't even a criminal offense. There's no battery if there's no injury. Do you want to find out how many lawyers are lining up to turn this into a civil rights case?" Zarya said calmly. The room inhaled. Hard. Charles turned to his chief of staff. "File the suspension paperwork immediately, and start the inquiry into his entire precinct history. I want every civilian complaint on my desk before sunset." "Yes, sir." Brad's voice cracked. "You don't have jurisdiction over—" "I don't need jurisdiction, officer," Charles said, steel in his tone. "I have the public, and they're watching." He gestured subtly toward the crowd. By now, over half the cafe was filming. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Live. One woman near the door said, "He needs to be fired. That's assault." Another man added, "This is what happens every day to people who aren't the mayor's daughter." Brad took one stumbling step back. Charles stepped forward. "Turn in your badge." "What?" "You heard me." Brad looked around, but no one came to his defense. Not his fellow officers. Not the barista. Not even the patrons who'd once laughed at his crude jokes. Silence swallowed the room. Zarya walked past him without another glance. She picked up her bag, still wet, laptop inside ruined, and turned toward the door. But then she paused, turned back, and said one final line. "Let this be a lesson, Officer Connolly. Not about who I am, but about who you think we aren't." She left without waiting for a reply. Outside, the city was already watching. Within an hour, footage from 3 angles had made it to social media. One clip showing the exact moment the coffee hit her hit 2 million views by lunch. By afternoon, news trucks were parked outside City Hall. By evening, Brad Connolly's name was suspended from the department roster. But the story was no longer just about him. It was about every unseen moment before this one. Every woman who didn't have a mayor for a father. Every officer who poured something worse than coffee and walked away. And Zarya, she wasn't hiding. That night, she tweeted one sentence. "Privilege protected me, but it shouldn't take power to earn respect." Then she added a second. "I won't let this stop at headlines. This time, we build something that lasts." By sunrise the next morning, the footage had already crossed state lines. CNN ran it in a split-screen panel with the headline, "Mayor's Daughter Assaulted by Officer, Justice or Optics." Fox called it a staged stunt, implying Zarya had lured the officer into confrontation. MSNBC framed it as a flashpoint in America's long war between law enforcement and equity. But for Zarya, it wasn't a headline. It was heat, emails, DMs, threats, praise, offers, attacks. By 9 a.m., her inbox had over 7,200 unread messages. Some hailed her a hero, others a liar. Posts were accusing her of abusing power, of weaponizing race, and of being another pampered liberal elite who couldn't handle a joke. And then there were the death threats. Not subtle ones either. Her address was posted on 2 hate forums before Twitter flagged it. Her old college photos were doxed. Someone tried to cancel her voter registration online. She sat at her kitchen table, wearing the same damp shirt from the day before, watching it unfold on 5 different screens. local news, Twitter, Instagram, text messages, even WhatsApp blowing up from her old debate team group. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from clarity. Across town, her father was holding the line. Charles Bell's press secretary scrambled to draft statements. The City Hall's legal team reviewed every protocol. Civil rights groups called for investigations. Police unions, predictably, were already circling the wagons, claiming procedural misconduct. And through it all, Mayor Bell refused to apologize. "My daughter deserves the same dignity as every resident in this city," he said at a morning press briefing. "And if this incident makes you uncomfortable, good. That's the first step toward change." Still, the storm swirled faster than any one speech could contain. Reporters flooded Zaria's street. Protesters began forming in front of the precinct. And then came the letter. It arrived at noon. Delivered by hand. A formal petition from 39 local organizations, community coalitions, activist groups, student bodies, and 2 political action committees. They didn't want her to just speak out. They wanted her to run. Not for council, not for the advisory board, for city comptroller. A real position, with real oversight on law enforcement budgets, community programs, and police accountability funds. Zaria read the opening line 3 times before setting the envelope down. "You're being invited," it said. "Not because you're the mayor's daughter, but because we saw you take a hit and not flinch. We need that kind of spine in the office." That evening she met her father on the rooftop of their family's old brownstone. It was tradition, where they went when they needed silence louder than speeches. He looked tired, not in the eyes, his were still razor-sharp, but in the shoulders. "They're going to come for you harder now," he said simply, gazing out at the skyline. "I know. They'll say you're using your last name, that you're buying justice instead of earning it. I've heard worse. They'll come after me, too." Zaria turned to him. "Wouldn't be the first time." He cracked the faintest smile, then silence again, until he said, "Do you want this, Z?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her ruined laptop, the one still sticky with dried coffee. She opened the screen. Black, broken, dead. She placed it between them. "That's what the system feels like," she said. "Burned, shattered, everyone pretending it still works when it's fried through." She looked up. "I don't want to just fix it. I want to replace it." He nodded once, then did something rare. He placed a hand on her shoulder, firm, grounding. "Then make them regret ever thinking you were just the girl in the coffee shop." The next morning, Zaria walked into her first public forum. No podium, no handlers, no PR team, just her. And the city. Packed into a community center gymnasium, people lined up shoulder to shoulder. Some are still unsure, some skeptical, some angry, and she welcomed it all. When she stepped up to the mic, she didn't start with stats or slogans. She started with a confession. "I didn't plan to be here," she said. "I didn't plan to be anyone's face of justice. I just wanted a quiet cup of tea and a little dignity." She let that hang. But when you get burned in public, you have 2 choices. You shrink, or you stand. She looked out over the crowd. "I choose to stand, not just for me, but for every woman who wasn't believed, every protester who got shoved, every student who was told to be more polite instead of being protected." A murmur of approval. And then came the applause. Not polite, not performative, but real. Because for the first time in a long time, they weren't just hearing a promise. They were hearing a plan. Election day arrived on a gray, wind-swept Tuesday. The city of Chicago buzzed with that electric stillness, the kind that sits just beneath the surface when everyone knows something bigger than ballots is on the line. And at the center of it all was Zaria Bell, standing outside the very same community center where just 6 months earlier she'd first spoken up. She wasn't wearing campaign colors. She wasn't flanked by political consultants or camera crews. She wore a plain white shirt. And pinned to it, dead center on her chest, was the faint brown stain, the one that never fully came out from that day in the cafe. Not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a warning. She wasn't here to be polished. She was here to be unforgettable. The night she announced her candidacy, people said she'd never survive the first month. "She's too young. She's too angry. She's just the mayor's daughter." But Zaria never tried to deny those things. She leaned into them. She told her story again and again, not the one about being assaulted, but the one that came after. The story of standing up, speaking the truth, building alliances across race, class, and even with officers who wanted reform but were too afraid to speak. She didn't just run a campaign, she ran a blueprint. By fall, she'd held more town halls than any other candidate in the race. She walked through neighborhoods where cops once slammed her peers against squad cars and asked kids what they would do with a public safety budget. She met with families of people lost to violence and listened without promising quick fixes. She invited dissenters into the room, let them talk, let them challenge her, and responded not with platitudes but with policy. She didn't raise the most money, but she raised something rarer: trust. On election night, the final votes trickled in just before midnight. It wasn't a landslide, but it was enough. Zaria Bell, City Comptroller of Chicago, the youngest in city history, the first black woman in the role. And as she stepped onto the stage to give her victory speech, the crowd surged not just with applause, but with relief, like they'd been holding their breath for far too long. She looked out over the sea of faces: students, mothers, street vendors, teachers, ex-cops, baristas. She took the mic, paused, and said, "6 months ago, someone poured coffee on my chest because he thought I was nobody." A ripple of murmurs. And maybe in that moment, I was, to him, to the system, just another black woman to disrespect, dismiss, dehumanize. She held up the same shirt. The stain is visible under the lights. "But this stain," she said, "it's not shame. It's a reminder that sometimes it takes being burned to realize what you're willing to fight for." Silence, heavy, powerful. We are not here to ask for dignity. We are not here to beg for inclusion. We are here to build systems that don't require power to earn respect. We don't want to be the first. We want to be the start of many. And then in her softest voice, barely above a whisper, "So if you've ever been told to know your place, let me remind you, your place is anywhere you stand tall enough to shake the room." The crowd erupted, not just in claps, but in catharsis. And somewhere in the back of that gym, her father stood with misted eyes, his fists clenched not in anger, but in awe. He didn't step forward, didn't steal her spotlight, because this moment wasn't about him. It never was. Later that night, long after the cameras had packed up and the volunteers had gone home, Zaria sat alone in her office. The lights were dim. The city outside hummed like it always did. She looked at the chair across from her, the same one where Officer Connolly had once slouched while being untouchable. That chair was empty now. But Zaria didn't feel alone. She thought of her grandmother, of her classmates, of the barista who recorded the video, of Chris Meyer, the young cop who came forward, of every quiet voice that had cracked the silence just enough for truth to pour in. She smiled, then whispered to herself, "Let them pour the coffee. We'll pour the fire,